Hi.
Hello there.
I'll sit so you can see me. So we have a few classes here. We'll probably have some people trickling in, but I'm just going to
Okay.
go ahead and announce our Living Writers series, and then I'll introduce you. But I'm going to stand over here so I'm near the microphone so you won't be able to see me.
Okay.
So welcome everybody to the Living Writers series. Has anybody been to a Living Writers event before? Just a couple of you. All right, so the Living Writers events were designed to help you feel like you're in a community of writers. How many people here write outside the classroom? Yeah, all right, good number. Okay, good. Glad to see my students are raising their hands. So you know how hard it is. You know how much revision goes into it and how much work and struggle goes into it. And these events are designed to show you that professional writers are going through exactly the same thing, that the revision and the struggle doesn't stop no matter how good you get. So you might want to stop now if that's discouraging to you. Otherwise, I'm hoping it's actually encouraging and that these conversations will lead to a stronger community that actually fosters that kind of work. So I'm going to introduce Patricia Gaborik, who is our guest this evening. And this is also our first recorded event. So this is going to be archived on the Living Writers Anthology, which we're designing. And so this will be for posterity. Patricia Gaborik lived most of her life in the Chicago area and completed her undergraduate studies at Northwestern University. In addition to being a playwright, she is a theater historian who specializes in 20th century Italian theater. 8 years ago, she moved to Rome, where she teaches literature and theater in a college study abroad program, works as a freelance translator, and collaborates with the English Theater of Rome, which produced her last play, Finishing the Kitchen, in 2010, and is now planning to stage Down the Aisle, which you've all read, in the upcoming season. She holds 3 other degrees, all in theater studies, an MA from the University of California, Santa Barbara, a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and a PhD from the University of Rome. So, welcome, Patricia. So before we get started, I just want to ask, because there are 2 versions now circulating, which will actually, I think, make for very interesting conversation. Who has read the version in the hardback and the anthology? Raise your hands. Okay. And who has read the newer version? My class, all raise your hand because that's what you've read. We've looked at a few pages from the older version and have talked a little bit about revision, but that at least gives you a sense of what the audience has seen. So.
Okay. Perfect. Great. Okay, well, I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit how I got started as a playwright and also where Down the Aisle fits kind of in the arc of my writing without going into a lot of detail. But revision was already a key word that's been said, and it's actually a play that's gone through a pretty long process. So I thought I'd put that a little bit in the bigger context too of how long I've been doing this and when I got started and everything. So I've been doing theater in general since I was about 13. I really started out acting in a little community theater in my hometown, which is in southern Wisconsin, pretty close to Chicago, and knew pretty much immediately that this theater thing, this is what I'm going to do. In some ways. Early on, I thought that probably meant acting, and when I went to college, I was still pretty much of that mind. But one of the really terrific things about the Northwestern program, it's a big program that trains scholars, it trains actors, it trains directors, it trains everybody, and it basically trains everybody to do a little bit of everything. So my undergraduate career in the theater started out where I did a little bit of everything. I did stage management, I did sound design, I did lighting design, scene painting, all of those sorts of things. I actually think that's been really important in my formation as a writer, really as a playwright, because there's just something really important about having a sense of the mechanics of the theater, how it all works together. Certainly for me, as I put my plays together. So I think that was really fundamental for me. My junior year, I took a playwriting class and have been writing ever since. even though particularly in the beginning, in the first years out of school and then into graduate school, I did a lot more combining of writing with other theatrical work. I still did a lot of stage managing. I started doing some directing and other things like that that would come up from time to time. What I really prefer to do now, given that I've gone on to study and really the bulk of my time is dedicated to my work as a scholar, I really have to pick and choose. And so my preference is to focus on the writing alone, not do very much directing, not doing all sorts of other things. One has to make choices at a certain point. I sort of feel like I can't do it all and do it all very well, and the writing is really where my passion lies, and whether that's writing as a scholar or as a playwright. The last time I directed was just a couple years ago. It was 3 years ago, but I actually directed my own piece, my own play, Finishing the Kitchen, when the English Theatre wanted to perform that. But typically, I prefer to sit at my desk rather than sit in the house and tell people what to do. So Down the Aisle is one of my earlier pieces in some way, and it's pretty uncharacteristic of those in the sense that it's actually out for public consumption. It's a lot of my other earlier pieces I basically considered dead, and I wouldn't necessarily pull them out to be published or to be produced. But there's Down the Aisle, I think, is a piece that I've sort of thought through the years is problematic, but there was something at the core of it that I really liked, and so so I keep coming back to it. The first version that I wrote of it, I wrote in 2003, so it's actually a piece that's 10 years old now, and has gone through, I guess, really 3 major steps. When I first wrote it, I was living in Wisconsin again at the time, and entered it in a contest for Wisconsin Playwrights, and it was one of the winners, and so it was produced. And so I saw that production a couple of times, and it was an okay production, nothing special, but it was important for me because it gave me a clear sense of the things that I liked about the piece, and especially its sort of theatrical elements and how those could be enhanced, and also a pretty clear sense of what I wasn't so crazy about. So that first production, I think, was really important, even though then I let the piece sit for quite a while, for a couple of years. In the meantime, I moved to Italy, and I had been had done my first dissertation, my first PhD in the meantime, so hadn't actually been thinking a lot about the play or producing it until I got in touch with the English Theatre of Rome, and they had asked me to do something, but in that moment I was working on a new play, and so I gave them the new play instead. Down the Aisle kind of sat on the back burner for a while. With another old piece that had been performed a number of times. And it was really then just a couple of years ago, right before it was published in your anthology, that I took it back out and said, okay, don't let this just sit there in the drawer anymore, get back to it. And then, and now just again, in the last couple of months, the English theaters come back to me and said, let's do something else, let's do a new or sort of a new old piece. And I said, maybe this is the moment. And so, hence the third revision, and then the two versions that you have circulating among you. It's one of the interesting things about playwriting is that writing the play is really just a first step, and it sort of feels real and valuable and alive for me when it's actually going to be produced and being read too. is nice, but there are these sort of two steps, and so it's always taken a sort of external push. In one case, it was the publication in the anthology, and this time around, it's let's actually put it on stage. And so those are really great motivators to keep working on that piece that otherwise kind of sits there taunting you sometimes. I actually think, well, one thing I should say is because the piece is probably, it's up for production this season, if we can sort of get the schedule and the director and all sorts of, and all of those elements in line. So next week, probably already, I'll hear another reading of the play with actors, and that'll actually be the first time that I hear the latest version, the version that most of you have read. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see if I'm happier this time with it. I actually think the piece is in pretty good shape now, but that moment of reading or production, even more so, are always really, really important for me personally, and I think for most playwrights. And that's really because if I sit down and think about it, there are three principal things that happen, and one is that you just simply get to see or hear it, and how it really comes out, or at least get a better sense, because of course it's all conditioned on how prepared the reading is, how well the actors read, and so on and so forth. But something different really happens when you know, it goes from your head, or even my voice. I tend to read out loud a lot when I write, but there's just a whole other level that the text gets taken to when you hear it in that sense. So that's the first thing. The second thing is quite simply, you just get feedback. You have a whole group there that reads it and tells you what they think. And then third, I would say, even without the explicit feedback, even if nobody tells you anything, just hearing or seeing the way that anybody else presents the work, inevitably you get something from that, in that you see what they take from the text and how well that corresponds to what you think you've put on the page. So those are definitely really important things for me. One of the things, I think I'll say this to you, could be interesting, given that you're a sort of split group and that you've got two versions of the text among you, even if you haven't all looked at both versions, is that one of the things that I'm sort of looking to see when we do this next reading next week is the final scene of the play, which has been every time the main focus of my revisions. During that first production, it was something that I kept tweaking a little bit, and I've adjusted it over time. Both when we published in the anthology, that was one of my main targets, and then this third time around, just recently, it was, which was actually the biggest revision I did, this very last one, but that final scene was really key. And the thing that I found myself unsatisfied every time was that I felt like the ending before this last version was perhaps too sentimental, and by that I think what I mean in part is that it seemed too well resolved, as if it was almost a little bit too much of a happy ending, and if that in some ways that maybe didn't do justice to kind of complexity of the relationships, in particular between Katie and her mother. And so that was something that I really tried to work on in this final version. And I think the new ending certainly gets to that. It's harsher and it's much more melancholic than the second time around already. And the second time around is the one that's in your anthology, just to be clear. And then the third one is the latest version of Martha's Class. My concern, though, is that it's possible that Katie comes across as too harsh, not sympathetic enough, or maybe not understanding enough. And what I mean by that is she's perhaps not sympathetic enough to the audience because she doesn't seem understanding enough of her mother, or sort of compassionate enough toward her mother. Another writer friend of mine actually read this last version of the piece and expressed that as one of her questions or concerns about the piece, which was actually one that I had already had as well. And this friend of mine put it really well. She said, okay, the thing that we get, the thing that's really clear in the play and in that final scene is that Katie's got a hole in her heart. And that's certainly about her dad. But it's also really about the disconnect with her mom. So in that final scene now, we definitely get the disconnect. That disconnect is certainly reinforced. But do we get that there's the hole in the heart? And I thought that was a really good question. And it's a question I'm not sure I know the answer to. And so that's something that I'm hoping the reading will be enlightening on. On one hand, when you're dealing with a play, it really always depends on the production, right? On what they bring out in the text. That said, when you're a playwright, it's your job to give the production staff what you want in the text. You can't just rely on them to create it for you if you haven't sort of correctly put it there in place. We'll see. We'll see what comes out of that reading, and maybe our discussion today will be enlightening for me as well on that point. So that's that. I don't know, time-wise, do you want to hear a little reading of a scene as we had talked about, or do you want to? I didn't keep very good time, so I don't know.
Maybe a very brief reading would be great, just to hear it in your voice.
Okay, okay. What I thought I would do, I know that one of the scenes that in Martha's class, at least, that you've read aloud is the first scene, and so I thought that it might be fun if I read one of the scenes that you had already listened to as well, sort of with the idea that it might be interesting or surprising to hear how I hear it or how I see it, and how that corresponds to how you had read and imagined it in class. This is at least in the abstract. In reality, I don't think I'm actually a very good reader, so I'm not sure how enlightening my read will be, but we'll give it a try and see what happens. What I'd like to do, just for the sake of sort of rhythm and flow, I'll read the stage directions, at least the more major ones, but I won't read the characters' names to signal who's talking, except for maybe in one or two points to make sure we don't get lost. So we'll see how it goes. So this is the very beginning of the play, Scene 1. Scene 1, the present. Downstage island lights up to reveal a young woman, Katie, scrutinizing herself skeptically in a full-length mirror. She wears a very simple white wedding dress, which she will wear throughout the play. She's not very comfortable in it, nor in the makeup she's applied for the big day. Her dad steps shyly into the light, as if peeking through a door. Katie senses his presence. Dad? I can't believe how you've grown. He enters and stands silently, speechless at the sight of her. A long moment passes as they smile at each other. He tugs at the sleeve of his suit jacket. She eventually asks, "Do I look all right?" "You're absolutely perfect." You always did know just what to say. "It's not too girly." "You look good as a girl." Katie smiles and laughs. Dad says, "Are you ready?" "Yep." "Nervous?" "Nah." "You?" Yep. Ready? No. Daddy, I can't help it. I do it pretty good, don't I? Jelly Bean, you're such a brat. Time to go. Katie nods and turns away from him to take one last look in the mirror. Dad slips away unnoticed. Katie smooths her dress, then smiles at herself in her bratty way. Pause. Lights fade slowly as Katie crosses into upstage right eye. That's it.
So I know we have a lot of questions here, so I turn it over to you guys.
Can I just do it from here?
Yeah.
So, hi there. This is
Hi.
Next. I have a question about the version that's in the anthology because my students have read it recently, and
Okay.
so you may already have answered this question in your revision, but students ask me when we read this if the father is dead at the very beginning of the play. And in fact, in scene 2 specifically, I think, when there's a little interaction that seems to be between the father and the mother talking about the bourbon. And they point to that and say, maybe he didn't die in the accident. Maybe he's still alive when she's 6, and before she turns 14, he dies. And I keep saying, I don't think so. I think he's supposed to be dead, but it's a good point that they make. And so I'm asking that on behalf of lots of my students who want to know.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. That was actually one of the, I think one of the principal queries that came up in the last actor's reading that we had done of the older version. And for 2 reasons the question came up. One was just, to sort of to get it straight and to get it right. And the other reason was that one of the writers at the reading had a little bit of a sense that Dad was already dead, and there was something, and there was already a sort of dynamic of Katie's frustration with Mom and things like that, and so there was potential thought that the play was too static in that sense, that the situation that we have in the beginning is the situation we have pretty much all the way through, which I didn't like. So I made a big adjustment to that first scene, second scene, because of course the first scene is the wedding opening, and I completely rewrote that whole first scene. In fact, the song and the bourbon exchange, which was one of those things that I liked. It was cute. It was hard to let go of, but it's gone entirely. And that was to change up that dynamic. But the impact in terms of in terms of the certainty of when Dad is dead, I don't know. Again, probably those of you who have read the third version could chime in about what you think. For me, the idea was, and certainly is now, that he's still alive in that first scene, and it's between the first scene and the second scene when they're teenagers that he dies. And but it's not very explicit, and one of the things that I actually did make more explicit to give a sense that something changed is that, and on a first read you may or may not notice and remember this, that there's also the mention of a baby sister, right, who then gets talked about later, that she is no longer there. But so that's one of the ways that I tried to sort of indirectly signal that something changed between that first scene and the latter scenes. It's one of the complicated things about the play because there's this question of what is Katie's memory, real memory, and what is imagination, right? And that's and it's tricky. I hope I find the right line between, or anyone who stages the play finds that sort of right line between a level of ambiguity that's okay and just confusion, right? So yeah, I think it's actually a great question, in particular in regards to that second version, because it was even actually potentially one of the problems of the text. For me, it was already clear in that second version that Dad was supposed to be dead, but I think it was clearer to me than it was.
Yeah, I find it much clearer in this new version, and you know, it's interesting, the baby sister does sort of disappear. I was just very interested by that because it seems Katie has this incredibly deep relationship with her father, and you know, there's no mention of the sister really after, and so there's this sort of selfishness on her part that struck me that I like, and I mean, I think that resonates then with her relationship with the mother that makes it believable. But you know, she is in some ways not so sympathetic.
Right.
There, but I'm not sure that bothers me really. You know, it's just. But we were interested. One thing we talked about was in fiction, you have all these ways of doing chronology and you know, some of the problems that you're facing here, trying to dramatize this, we just wouldn't really exist for us as fiction writers. But you know, you've really set up a challenge for yourself to have all these different chronologies going simultaneously and these interactions and bringing people on stage without ever mentioning that they're dead. You know, there's just all this unstated stuff going on that that is full of tension and great drama, but you know, it'd just be so much easier to do in fiction. So it's just interesting that you've chosen to take that on. Dai, did you have something?
Yeah, I actually have a question. Well, first, mi dispiace, non parlo di italiano. But the first thing I want to ask though is, when you were writing the play, the scene I'm talking about in particular is the last scene where they're playing catch with her dad.
Mm-hmm.
Did that scene stay constant in your revisions, or was it changed?
It was pretty. Let's see. The biggest revision I did was in the very last revision, the sort of basic structure of the scene has been there. It's cut a little bit in this last version. I felt like it. There was just a little bit too much repetition going on throughout the play. And particularly in that scene and the scene before, sort of a repetition of Katie's frustration with Mom, and Katie talks to Dad about it, and it was kind of one of those things where it's like, we got it already. And so one of the revisions that I worked on in particular for that scene was to smooth some of that out. And the other thing that I wanted to do, that I worked on particularly again in this last revision, was it was a sort of a double-sided thing. One was to up the tension between Katie and her father. You know, there's a sense there where, you know, there's this line where she says to him, you know, I don't understand. You're supposed to be the one who gets it. You're supposed to be the one that I can count on, right? And so there's this sort of growing frustration for her on, you know, why isn't Dad this person for me anymore, who's, you know, basically always the perfect dad. He always knows what to say. He's always the one who solves the problem. Mom always sort of messes up and makes him mad, but Dad is, you know, Dad is always just Dad. And but I, you know, there's something about that needed to be troubled, also because Katie's growing up and she's also moving into a space where she realizes just imagining Dad there isn't just the thing that happens anymore. so what I was, so on one hand, I wanted to sort of up that tension. On the other hand, the thing that I really worked on in this last, in the last revision that I don't think was present at all actually before, was that we get a stronger sense that this is an ideal image of Dad that Katie's creating. Right, in the last part of the scene, the thing that I tried to bring out was when she says, okay, I need your help with Mom, I need you to help me convince Mom about this Spain thing. In the earlier version, the second version, the anthology version, Dad sort of goes along with it. He says, yeah, I got you, okay, I'm here for you. In this last version, he never really does that. He kind of says, I don't know. I'm not sure what I can do. And she hears all of that as, yes, honey, of course, I'll do everything you want me to, right? And so that was important for me to, to sort of start showing that regardless of what he says, Katie keeps imagining, in one part of the scene, Dad is always the one who fixes things, even if she's just felt the frustration that Dad isn't the one who fixes things. So it's really an important moment of growth for Katie, and that's the biggest, that's the sort of newest aspect of that scene in terms of the meat of it. The rest is structural in terms of streamlining, shortening, things like that. So I don't know if there was something in particular about the scene that you were curious about, but that's the general response about what happened there.
Can I ask one more? In scene 2, the baseball, did you look up, the tips were really specific in general. Did you look anything up about baseball?
I did some refresher. I actually played t-ball and softball a lot as a kid. And so it was really just memory. But then I did sort of, I actually watched a video because I thought there's going to be a good detail in there that I'm not remembering, right? So I went and, found a good batting stance video online just to see if there was there was something I could tweak. But no, most of that stuff, sports I found, and baseball in particular, have recurred in a couple of my pieces. There's a big part of my growing up, and so they're images that are really clear to me. So luckily there, I didn't actually have to do a lot of looking up. Most of it was memory work.
Well, it's interesting because there's so many American themes that go through this. The baseball, the hot dogs, all these sort of American symbols, and you live in Rome, far away from all this. So we talked about that a little bit. I'm wondering if there are any questions, because you asked questions in the anthology that we discussed some, but are there any questions on this new version that you might have that we could maybe respond to, like any specific question?
Well, I don't think the questions are new, actually. I think probably the big question that for me has just got to be the most important one every time around is when you get it that Dad is dead, right? Because that changes everything in production. And so that's always kind of, if I have a captive audience like I do here, that's always the principal thing that I want to know. I guess, I guess about this version, one of the things that's different is I'd be curious about not so much the difference between Katie's relationship with her mother and her father, but the character of the mother herself. I think, just to give you a little context, at the last reading that we did, which was of course of the anthology version, a few people who were there listening, either actors who were reading or people who were just there listening, commented on how Mom is not basically not a great mom. She's not very, she's sort of, you know, not always so loving and helpful and caring to Katie. And I thought that was really important because that wasn't necessarily my intention. The intention was to convey that Katie sees her mom that way, but not necessarily that that was the truth about her mom, right? And so I sort of had these alarm bells going off when that was said to me. So I think that's probably one of the things I would be curious about, in particular about this latest version, would be the perception of mom herself as a mom, as a character, as her interactions there.
Thoughts on that? Did you have?
I just
Speak loudly so she.
She hasn't, this is not an answer to that question though.
Oh, you have a question, another
Yeah, but
question.
maybe we should stick with this first question that's on the table and come back to that. She has a question at the end.
Oh, okay. All right. So, considering the mother figure, the mother character in this,
The latest version.
in this latest version, so this would be more directed to my class. Thoughts on it?
The way I perceive the mother in the latest version of the poem, she's not very relevant throughout the poem, but you can sense the tension between Katie and her mom, which for me, it took me to read it twice to realize actually at what point in the play did the dad die, because the mom wasn't very much active in it, and you can see Katie and her dad talking a lot through the poem, through the play. So I perceive the mother as just a regular mom, you know, teenage girl going through teenage problems. She's gonna clash with her mom regardless. I didn't see her as a unloving mother though. I didn't get that feeling.
Okay.
I don't know. Your name? Ruth. Oh, Ruth, there you are. I'm sorry, I couldn't see you.
Well, I portray the mother as not a good mom because, like, for example, when she's telling her about what happened with the cheerleading situation, she was actually, like, treating her bad and saying to her, like, no, you can't do, you know what I'm saying? Like, to me, I wouldn't see your mom doing that or speaking to the door, like, you know, in that type of way. Like, you're no good in that sense, you know? So,
Jennifer?
I saw, you know, I kind of picked up a lot on the mom's grief, kind of in the way she was learning how to relate to her daughter in a way that only her father had before. And that's the way I looked at it. You know, this is a whole new experience for her, and she's trying her hardest to relate to her daughter, and her daughter's going through the same grief she is, and, you know, is, you know, only, this is something dad would fix. Why can't you get it? Why don't you get me? But the mom's trying her hardest, and, you know, it's a learning experience for both of them.
Right.
Di, did you have something to say?
I was going to say the same thing she said.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to compete with the dead, right, Kellyanne?
I felt like Katie never really gave her mother the chance to connect with her, because we were talking in class about the ball, how that was a symbol, and as you see, it was like a triad. It was always Katie, her brother, and her father, never really the mother. She was never really in the mix.
I wanted to say something about the ball. Throughout the play, Katie finds resolution by talking to her dad while they play softball. And the way I perceived it when they had their first argument, I believe in scene 5, if I'm not mistaken, he gets upset that she wants to go and travel the world and is not really interested in softball anymore. I wanted to know if your intentions was to have that softball as a connection, as a way of dad knowing he was dead, and knowing that if she didn't focus on softball that she would forget about him. Is that how, because that's how I perceived it. Like if she started cheerleading, then she wouldn't really want to play softball, and she wouldn't really have that connection with her dad.
Yeah, you know, actually, it's I looked at the play again today, and that's a question that I myself thought particularly about today in ways that I hadn't thought of before, because of course the play really functions on 2 levels. they're right. If you don't know that dad is dead, it seems real, basically. And so the conflict is between her and dad, and it's dad saying, what do you mean something's taking the place of softball? That's not good. That's always been our thing, right? It's clear that there's something about that that's hurtful to him. But once we know that dad is dead, it's not hurtful to dad. It's Katie's struggle. And so there's something about that scene that becomes important where it's Katie herself that's realizing, but if I let go of softball, am I letting go of dad, right? Whether it's cheerleading, I mean, with cheerleading early on, it just seems like a sort of an additional thing that she's trying to do. Katie's always trying to do something new, unlike her brother, right? But as when it comes to this choice between leaving softball behind for something new, I think that's another reason that's a moment of growth for her, because she says, oh, if I'm leaving, you know, this symbol of dad behind, wow, am I leaving dad behind? So I can't say that was my intention, you know, sort of really clearly, explicitly as I was writing. But when, you know, I sort of rewriting and read it, I actually kind of went, ooh, that's nice. that works well. That's good. But I think that's all because of this sort of double level going on there. That's sort of, if we're watching this and thinking it's real, it's a conflict between the two of them. And once we realize that he was never there, then it's all interior for her. So yeah, great observation.
You had a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious to know who was driving in the car accident, because at the end there is, when she was saying it's all my fault, what exactly the mother meant by that?
Right, okay. Well, in particular, when she's saying it's my fault, I think she's saying it's my fault that we didn't do the stuff you used to do, that we used to do as a family, right? I didn't keep taking you fishing, I didn't keep taking you out camping, and it's my fault that I didn't do. In my mind, it was Dad was driving the car. Dad was driving the car, and then there's this was actually something that was more explicit in the anthology version than in the new one. That Katie imagines this day where essentially, you know, she wasn't in the car that day. The rest of them were. So that's how Joe got hurt. That's how Dad and sister died. So Katie got lucky because she wasn't there, right? So, which is actually something pretty interesting to think about, because then maybe, presumably, and this isn't something I've done explicitly, but were Katie and Mom the only two who weren't in that accident? So that's a sort of interesting level for a director, for example, to think about. The two sort of full survivors are the two that have this distance between them. So, in my mind, that's the way it happened.
How would you describe Katie's development throughout the story? And do you think she was better off physically without her father being there? Like, did she become more responsible in her adolescent years?
Hey. Responsibility is a good question, because one of, well, as Martha noticed, there's this sort of selfish thing about Katie, right? All the way through, that doesn't really go away. I think the counter to that is her relationship with her brother, right? If there's one place where we see her being nurturing and thinking about somebody else, it's definitely with him and towards him. But Katie's so stuck on you know, on this absence of the dad. I think there's something, there's definitely some non-maturing going on for her, and I think it's not until that final scene when she says, you know, maybe we should stop imagining that she's sort of going, wow, I've been, I've been slow. I've been slow to grow up. Maybe it's time, right? She says it to her mom, but she's saying it as much about herself and to herself, I think, as she is to her mom. It's kind of in her bratty character to lash out at mom, and that's a definite sort of not growing up, right? Part of her ongoing difficulties of her mom is that she's an eternal adolescent in her relationship with her mother, which is not uncommon. It's hard to break those habits sometimes.
Can I add to that? One of my students in reading the anthology made an interesting note on what you're saying, which is when we reflect back on the advice and the kindness that the father is showing to Katie throughout, including advice about give your mom a break, we realize later that that's all Katie's advice to herself, and that seemed to really mitigate her brattiness in some way. That she does have the insight, and she tries to talk herself out of it, but there's something that seems, the father is Katie, right? I mean, the words, his words are her invented words for him, right?
Right.
Imagination.
So I've actually had the thought that the ideal performance of this play would be to do it twice. Right? Act 1 is do the play one time, and then Act 2 is see it again, knowing what we know.
But how many people? I mean, I think this is a question you had earlier. How many people caught on fairly quickly that the father was dead? So, and I don't know if it's because you heard other talk about it, or you just sat down and read it and you caught it.
I believe it's the choice of words she used in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one was like his presence, like she felt his presence, like only presence she can feel basically is someone that's dead. So.
Right, of course, with the stage direction, yeah.
Yeah, and the opening stage cue, when you said he shyly stepped into the light, I guess if you're watching it, you wouldn't notice it, but reading it, when I saw step into the light, I immediately thought he must be dead. He's stepping into the light.
But I
Okay.
think even watching it, it would have that effect.
Yeah, like he just and when she looks in the mirror and he disappears, like he just happens to walk off stage. But if you had written it differently, where he looked like they were both looking in the mirror and you couldn't see his reflection, you'd immediately know. Like you gave hints, and I like that because you didn't necessarily know until you got further through. But those little hints were fun. Like once you really found out.
Right.
I read the anthology version.
Can you speak really loudly so that?
I'm sorry. I read the anthology version. So when Katie was speaking with Joe about getting a ride, and he was going back and forth with her about whether he would take her or not, and she said if it were up to Dad, and he said Katie, and she said what? I kind of got this like feeling right there because I have a brother and I imagined the conversation, and it kind of struck me at that point too.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting this idea of the father being so perfect really is about how we perceive the dead and how our imaginations gloss over things, which is why I don't have such a problem as your friend has with the mother not being so perfect and being, not sympathetic, because actually I think that is how we sort of perceive the living and the dead, particularly in this kind of a relationship where the girl has lost a parent and he's become sort of what her, perfect answer would be to being a parent. And I sort of like the mother tries in her own way with the cheerleading. I agree, like there's something a little misguided about it, but she's trying in her own way to comfort her. I don't see that as meanness. I just see it as not, it's a little bit of cluelessness of how to deal with the situation. Yeah. So.
Yeah, she's definitely awkward, right?
Yeah. Yeah, she's a little. In fact, I might even like more of the mother in some ways. Maybe more of her around just to have a sense. I mean, she does come to feed them. She asks about the brats and the hot dogs. So she knows their taste. asking about their food choices.
Right.
But maybe a little bit more of her would be, would give us a sense of just more her cluelessness rather than her a meanness to her. Because I didn't have that sense that there was.
Okay. Right. Right.
Do you want the reader to know that the father has passed away right from the beginning? Did you write the ending or the beginning knowing that you could or you might not pick it up?
Ideally, no. Ideally, no. But I'm actually a little bit uncertain about when the ideal moment is. Initially, I really wanted it to be a revelation at the end, right? And then that, sort of leaves us in this whirlwind of, oh, wait, wait. Now I have to sort of rethink this whole thing. But there are a couple problems with that. One is that if you want the whole play to sort of to live on the surprise, if it's not a surprise, then what have you got, right? You need something else there. So it was important for me to balance it and not make it about the big twist at the end, right? There has to be something else that's compelling, even if somebody already gets it in scene 2. I mean, I think one of the things to think about is that when I write, I don't write thinking about a reader. I think about a spectator. So it's a little bit different. That said, I've actually adjusted some of the way I write the stage directions and things like that because I didn't want to give everything away right away. Like that stage direction at the very end of the play, that's the note about performing scene 5. In a typical play, I would just put that at the beginning of the scene. But I did kind of like to have the possibility open for the reader of a surprise. But the reader isn't the first person that I write for, sort of in that sense. I think the other difficulty about sort of saving, having the surprise is that really, typically, sort of playwriting 101, the sort of baseline is drama is about conflict. Plays are about conflict. And so one of the most difficult things about this piece is that most of the play is centered on a really nice relationship between a girl and her dad, right? So a sort of typical director reading the play, thinking about performing, will say, well, where's the problem here? Where's the conflict? You don't know necessarily what the conflict is until you get to that moment where you realize, this is all been imagined. So there's a certain aspect where if there's sort of some suspicions early on and then it becomes clear somewhere before the end, I think that's okay with me. Luckily, when it goes on stage, I'm not the one who has to make the decision. There's a director who has to decide, when do I want this reveal, and kind of play accordingly. So I get myself out of that in one particular way. Obviously, I have to try and set things up right. If I don't want to reveal too soon, to not. It's a really fine balance between, getting in those few things that later we rethink and go, that's why she said that. That seemed weird, and giving too much away. It's probably the most delicate thing.
Well, it's true that it's very different reading it than watching it be performed, and you can do so much. I mean, I think that's what's so interesting about this play too, is that it can exist in all these different formats. We can know from the beginning, and I find it fascinating. And I've read it, multiple times, knowing, I still find it a really compelling play. So I think knowing it works. I think not knowing it works. And I think I like your idea of seeing it in 2 different ways, performed in 2 different. So yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't hinge just on that surprise at all. I don't think. Other questions?
Question about setting. Some of my students thought that the earlier scenes could be in the backyard or at a campground. mentioned that they've gone camping in the past?
I actually didn't hear the question at all. Can you?
Some of her students thought that the setting could be either in a backyard or a campground. So the question is that where it might be set?
Yeah, could that
Right. Well, for me, certainly it's a campground, right? Because that's well, basically because they're clearly on vacation, right? They've brought all the fishing gear and they've gone to a lake at least early on. I think there's two. Then there's this talk about, we should have done that more. We should have done that more. So there's something in the opening scene where there was a special event, and this camper. That's another one of those very American things. Hop in the camper and go everywhere we need to go. But that too, when performance happens. Different choices are made, and sometimes they become interesting.
Thank you so much. It's 7 o'clock our time, which means it must be, what, 1 in the morning your time?
It's 1 in the morning here.
So, way past your bedtime, I'm sure. But this is, it's great just to, we had a lot of conversation about your play. It was very much enjoyed in class, and it's wonderful just to be able to see the process and to sort of talk about these two different versions of it and to think about how much goes in. So there's already a published piece and still you're revising it, and then you're going to watch another performance and still you're going to probably make tweaks, right? So it just doesn't stop no matter how far along in that process you get, which is, in some ways maybe discouraging, but in most ways I think very encouraging because that's how writing is, and that's how what you guys are going through right now. And just the way it is for all of us. So we're all in the same boat, and thank you so much for coming and Skyping in.
Sure.
and talking to us. And I will. We might have more questions come up, and so I might be emailing you some of those if you have time to respond to them.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you. Happy writing.